So what does the evening board meeting look like now? Laura greeted her husband's secretary with a sly smile as she rushed to button up her blouse at the door of his office. "Let me pass, darling." Like an approaching storm, she walked into her husband's office where he was hastily clearing the aftermath of their recent passion from his desk and pulling up his pants with one hand. "Need any help, Laura?" she asked coldly, leaning against the door frame with her arms folded across her chest. Inside, everything was boiling, burning, and filled with indignation. This man, whom she had spent 10 years of her life on, forgetting her own dreams and ambitions, now stood before her with his pants half down and couldn't utter a word. "Laura, no comments," she interrupted him. "So, how did it go? The director's meeting, I mean." "Laura, stop it. I'll explain everything." Finally, he fastened his belt and moved towards her. "Stop right where you are," the girl sharply exclaimed, startling the trader who froze in his tracks. "What's this all about?" His eyebrows furrowed. "Don't start a scene. I didn't need any hysterics." Laura wanted to unleash all her anger on him, but her innate composure prevailed. "I'll be waiting for you at home," she said as she turned on her heels and left the office with her head held high. "You finally showed up. Are you even planning to cook dinner?" Her mother-in-law, Ms. Amelie, who used politeness as her weapon, welcomed Laura in the hall. "While Henry is working his tail off, you're out and about with your plebeian friends, yes?" "Henry has really been working hard." Laura looked at the thin 60-year-old woman in her silk peignoir. "He's burning the midnight oil at work." Amelie's tattooed eyebrows shot up in astonishment. "Tell your son when he comes home that I'll be waiting for him upstairs, and someone else will handle dinner tonight." Laura nodded curtly and headed for the stairs. Her mother-in-law stared in disbelief at her departing daughter-in-law, who had never before taken such liberties. It had been 3 years since Amelie moved into her son's house under the pretext of a hypertensive crisis, and they had never spoken to each other in such a tone before. What's gotten into her, this insignificant girl? The daughter of a schoolteacher of the German language had never been to her liking. Why did Henry decide to marry her? They had met in college, fallen in love, and then drifted apart, looking for partners within their own circles. Amelie had always dreamed of marrying Henry off to her close friend's daughter, the heiress to a jewelry business. Instead, her son married this rootless pauper, and even a red diploma in design didn't make her a more attractive match. In her room, Laura collapsed onto the bed and closed her eyes. Pain and resentment engulfed her, tears rolled down her cheeks. It hurt almost as much as when her mother passed away. She had burned out so quickly that Laura didn't have time to spend with her or properly say goodbye. Laura never knew her father. Her mother said he had died before her birth. She had no other relatives left in the world. Ms. Obi supported her on her meager teacher's salary while Laura was in school, and during her first year at college, she also tutored and cleaned floors at the local supermarket to supplement their income. Sometimes Laura didn't see her mother for entire days, but she never complained about life. There were no men in her life, despite many suitors attempting to fill that void. This woman was smart, beautiful, and alone. Laura knew her father had been her mother's only love, a fidelity she had maintained throughout her life. At times, overcome by sadness over her mother, Laura would dial her home phone number and listen to the long, mournful rings. And now she was 30 years old, no children, no job, and now no husband. Laura knew she could never forgive this betrayal. Truth be told, their marriage had been falling apart for a long time. They had married for love right after university, and 3 months later, Henry's father passed away, leaving him a profitable construction and landscape design business. He had made it clear back then that she should quit her job, the one she had secured during her 3rd year of college, and focus on the home, domestic life, and not think about a career. At the time, she thought it was fair, and she willingly immersed herself in household chores, hoping for children to come soon. But they never did. All the necessary tests and procedures had been completed, and they had even started considering IVF options. But everything changed in an instant when Miss Amelie appeared in their home, and Laura stopped feeling like the mistress of her own life. Yes, she still did renovations, planted flowers in the garden, and cooked extravagant lunches and dinners, setting the table as if it were a Michelin-starred restaurant. However, the feeling of security and safety was no longer there. Lara got up from the bed, wiped away the tears flowing like a waterfall, and checked the bedside clock. It was 9 in the evening. To distract herself and relax a bit, she headed to the shower. As soon as she shed her clothes and turned on the water, she heard the front door slam downstairs. Damn, I need to hurry, she thought, and just in case, locked the bathroom door. As Laura stood under the hot streams, her thoughts gradually sorted themselves out. The sobbing subsided, and she, having dried herself thoroughly with a terry towel and on a bathrobe, stepped out of the shower. The bedroom was still empty. Lara approached the mirror where a slender hazel-eyed brunette with a mole above her lip stared back at her. Her short curly hair framed her sculpted face beautifully. Opening the wardrobe, she pulled out jeans and a t-shirt and dressed in them before leaving the room. No one was in the hallway, the living room, or the kitchen. Apparently, no one had arrived. Amelie must have gone out for the night, probably on her broomstick, Lara thought bitterly, amused. In the living room, she approached the antique buffet which held her pride and joy, a magnificent set made of the finest porcelain. She had bought it during her honeymoon in the German town of Worms. Henry had been baffled at the time, wondering why they couldn't buy a similar set in America instead of dragging it across half of Europe. But beautiful tableware, especially vintage pieces, was Lara's passion. Now she would have to leave all of it behind because Henry would likely not allow her to take anything, not because he needed it, but simply because that was his nature. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and in the next second, she heard her husband's voice. "Lara, are you here?" How she wanted to throw something at him. "I'm here," she replied, turning towards him. "I want to explain everything, really," he began stuttering as he sat down on the sofa. "Come here, please," he gestured to the nearby armchair. Lara silently complied and took a seat. She wanted to look him in the eyes, to ask why, but she couldn't summon the strength to lift her gaze from the newspaper lying on the coffee table in front of her. "So you're just going to stay silent?" Irritation crept into his voice. "Seriously, you won't ask anything, or do you just not care?" Finally, she found the strength to look at him. A complete stranger sat before her. "What should I ask?" she chuckled. "I can guess when it all began. Your evening meetings and business trips started exactly 3 months ago, though maybe even earlier. What's her name?" "I know that too. Helen, I believe that she's 23 years old, I know that as well. But do you know the reason?" Henry inched back, leaning against the sofa with one hand on the backrest, showing no signs of embarrassment. "I'm at a loss," her voice betrayed a quiver, but she managed to regain her composure. "Yes, because you've become so boring that it's maddening. You're either in the kitchen or running around antique shops for your silly porcelain trinkets. Damn it, there's nothing to talk to you about except roses, hibiscus, and junipers. And among your friends, you've got that crazy tank girl with her nosiness and sharp tongue. That is, tank girl Tiffany won't appreciate that," Lara thought, listening, her anger boiling inside. She couldn't speak out of hurt, although she should remind this man that she had sacrificed a successful career, her dream of starting her own business someday, all for the sake of their marriage. She should remind him that for 3 years she had endured his contentious and selfish mother who did everything to belittle her. "Are you finished?" Lara asked evenly, only tightly pressed lips and whitened knuckles betrayed her tension. "No," he paused for a moment. "Helen is pregnant, 5 weeks to be precise. I think Mom will be happy that she'll finally have a grandchild, a boy or a girl." He spoke with such casualness, as if they were discussing a menu for lunch. It was a gut punch. Lara closed her eyes, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "What a despicable person you are. How could I live with you for so many years and not see this? How could you?" His words oozed venom. "My dear, 2 years of dating and 8 years of marriage have turned you into a high society woman, a wealthy woman. You know very well the cost of your hobbies. Besides, you escaped poverty, the kind you and your mother endured in your one-room apartment with alcoholic neighbors next door. After that statement, Lara couldn't take it anymore. She leaned forward and slapped him hard across the face. "You scoundrel!" An immediate retaliatory strike followed, and Lara plunged into darkness. In the morning, she called the only close person who remained with her after her mother's departure and Henry's betrayal. "Tiffany, hi." Laura tried her best to keep her voice even and casual, but it still quivered. "Can we meet today?" "Right away." "Like this." "What happened?" Her friend's concerned voice made her smile. "Something happened, Tiffany, and I really need to talk to you." "Of course. I'm getting ready." "Dark sunglasses." Tiffany raised an eyebrow in surprise. When they met at their favorite cafe under the maple trees a couple of hours later, that's something new. Considering it's raining outside, Lara sat down across from her and silently removed her sunglasses. Before her friend's eyes appeared a large bruise on her cheek, smoothly transitioning under her left eye and concealed by 5 layers of foundation. "Oh my God, what is this, Lara? Where did it come from?" "Him," she answered tersely. "Life is changing, Tiffany. People change, or maybe they reveal their true selves." "Is it Henry?" Laura took a deep breath and recounted yesterday's story to Tiffany. "So she's pregnant." She leaned back in her chair and looked intently at her friend. "What will you do? Will you forgive him?" "If you do, I'll personally kill you." Lara looked away and gazed out at the street where the dismal October rain drizzled. "I'll leave." "How can you live with someone who betrayed you? Who dared to raise his hand against you? But you'll sue for your share of the property, won't you?" Tiffany sipped her latte and added another sugar cube. "Just hearing all of this is stressing me out. I don't think I'll succeed. Yesterday, when I winced from his slap," she sobbed, "my wonderful husband told me that I'll leave with what I came with. So, as you can imagine, without anything. He did allow me to take some clothes and a few pieces of jewelry he gave me. Of course, the car stays with his future wife and the mother of his child. That's what he said. Well, he's a bastard. Don't worry too much, we'll figure something out. With work, the most important thing is to leave that scoundrel with dignity. By the way, you can move in with me." Lara smiled a tear-soaked smile. "Thank you, dear, but I'll go back to my mom's apartment." "But nobody's lived there for several years. Can you imagine what it's like now?" "That's where Mom is, Tiffany. She's in everything, here, in the books on the shelf, in the photo frames, in the air. This is the only place on earth where I want to be right now, really." She hadn't noticed it herself, but tears welled up in her eyes. Tiffany simply held her hand in silence as she cried out her pain and anger. Finally, Lara wiped away her tears resolutely and weakly smiled. "Enough self-pity," she said, clapping her hands against her thighs. "Let's ask for the bill. I need to go to the apartment and tidy it up." "I'll go with you." "Of course, but you have work." "I'll take a sick day. I'll call right now." Tiffany pulled her latest iPhone from her bag with her chubby hand and dialed her boss's number. "Thank you," Lara whispered silently while Tiffany concocted a story about a sore throat and an emerging fever. The bill arrived, and the girls settled it before heading to Lara's mom's apartment. As soon as they unlocked the front door, a strip of light fell onto the hallway floor. Lara felt nervous. She hadn't been here much after her mom's death, and being here now made her uneasy. Inside, it smelled like an uninhabited space, full of sadness and emptiness. Lara turned on the lights, almost instinctively, and walked into the kitchen, with Tiffany following her there. Just as it always had been, everything was clean and neat. The kitchen unit, a gift from her son-in-law for her mother's anniversary, was slightly dusty but almost empty, except for the drawers where Soviet-era tableware and silver-plated cutlery were stored. The refrigerator door was slightly ajar, as if someone had just taken out some milk. One of the chairs was pulled out from under the table. It felt like someone was about to enter the room, and they would all sit down together as they used to around the round table, pour some delicious mint tea, and talk about trivial things that make up life. Tiffany, sensing her friend's mood, coughed loudly on purpose and started rummaging in the cupboards for the kettle. While she busied herself in the kitchen, Laura made her way to the bedroom. Everything was just as it had been when her mom was alive. The pull-out sofa was covered with a dusty sheet, simple but elegant wallpaper they had put up together a week before they received the dreadful diagnosis, the chandelier with its cobweb decorations, the chest of drawers with the old cathode ray tube TV. Laura had suggested her mother buy a modern flat-screen TV many times, but she always refused. The old furniture unit, taking up half of the room, was filled with books, china, crystal vases, various figurines, and picture frames with thank you notes from grateful students. Apparently, Laura inherited her love for vintage items from her mother. She opened the platinum wardrobe where her mother's clothes still hung. Laura couldn't bring herself to part with the clothes that still carried her mother's scent, the memory of her taking a blouse sleeve in her hand. Laura brought it to her face and inhaled the scent of the perfume her mother had always sprayed on her wrist. Oh, how much she missed her. Sad thoughts were interrupted by Tiffany's voice, who informed her that she had made tea. Back in the kitchen, Laura found that her friend had already wiped the dust, washed the teacups, and brewed tea, which was found in a tin box above the sink. Laura smiled gratefully at Tiffany. "What would I do without you, Tiffany?" "What, indeed?" Tiffany shrugged, taking a chocolate bar from her bag. "I just knew it, bought it this morning on the subway." They quickly drank their tea and, changing into Lara's old clothes, set to work. After sweeping away the cobwebs from the walls and ceiling and freshening up the kitchen, they sat down to rest. All that was left was to remove the curtains and the most challenging part, dusting the books and crystal in the wall unit. "Oh, Laura, you know what you need right now?" Tiffany looked mysteriously at her friend. "What?" "To fall in love." "What?" Laura caught on surprise. "Is that what I'm missing?" "No, really. You need good emotions right now," Tiffany said, moving closer to her friend and looking into her eyes. "I'm worried about you, Laura." Gratefully, she squeezed her hand and smiled. "I'll manage, you know I'm strong." "All right, let's finish up, shall we?" As if on cue, they both looked at the bookshelves. They seemed intimidating. Laura brought a basin of warm water and, armed with cloths, they began carefully removing books from the shelves. As she wiped the dust from yet another book spine, Laura smiled to herself. Her mother had assembled an entire library here. There was everything from Homer to Shakespeare, a complete collection of works, and Laura never had to look elsewhere for literature from her school curriculum. Miss Obie had a particular love for German literature, Goethe, Mann, Rilke, even Patrick Suskind. Goethe's Faust was something Laura knew almost by heart, thanks to her mother. She spotted Goethe with her eyes. It was a large antique book in German, dated 1896, and it had been in the house longer than Laura herself. When she picked it up, she felt a strange excitement. The yellowed pages were old and soft, with cracks in some places due to age. She caressed the rough surface and unexpectedly felt that there was something among the pages. She flipped through them with her fingers and saw a small envelope wedged between the 50th and 51st pages. Carefully taking it in her hands, Laura felt her palms getting sweaty from excitement. She looked at Tiffany, who paid her no attention, lost in thought. Should she tell her or not? It probably concerned her family. In the end, she decided to speak up. "Tiffany, come here for a moment." Tiffany looked away from the bookbinding she was cleaning and walked over to her friend. "What do you have here?" "Oh my, a letter," she shrugged. "I don't know." "Well, open it for heaven's sake." Tiffany stood up, hands on her hips, and looked at her friend as if she were a little girl. Laura nodded and opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a small gold ring with a blue gemstone. "Oh my goodness," Tiffany exclaimed with excitement. Laura, completely bewildered, examined the piece of jewelry. She had never seen it before and couldn't understand where it had come from. There had never been any secrets between her and her mother. The gemstone shimmered with thousands of facets under the artificial light of the chandelier, looking like a real diamond. But where could her mother, a German language teacher, have gotten a ring with a diamond? Laura was thoroughly confused. She and Tiffany sat down on the couch and started examining their unusual find. On the inside of the ring, there was a short inscription in German. Nagas what? Tiffany wondered. Where did this come from? Oh look, Laura, Tiffany pointed to a small symbol on the same inner side of the ring, just below the gemstone. It was either a hallmark or a coat of arms, finely engraved. Do you have a magnifying glass? Well, to magnify it, although wait a moment, she abruptly stood up and rushed into the hallway. Within a second, she was already taking pictures of the ring with her iPhone camera. After taking several photos, she zoomed in on the image as much as possible. Before their eyes was an illustration, a rose entwining a dagger, resting on a shield. It seems to be an antique ring, Laura observed. There's no modern hallmark here. Interesting. Where did Miss Obi get it? I don't know, the girl replied thoughtfully. Suddenly, she remembered the piece of paper that was in the same envelope. Unfolding it, she gasped at her mother's handwriting. It was a letter written in German. In the upper left corner, Laura deciphered partially faded lines with an address: Germany, Ronald Falls, Trier, Beaverstrasse 28A, Schwarzenberg. Holding her breath, Laura began to read. She thanked God for diligently learning German under the guidance of the best teacher in the world. Dear Alex, I am writing you a letter again, which will probably remain among my books, and I apologize in advance. I am guilty before you, very guilty, but I had no other choice, believe me. I am being punished enough because being away from you is the greatest pain in my life. You don't know many things, maybe that's for the best, otherwise, your attempts to find me would have continued. I really want you to be happy. With love, Obi. September 5th, 2000. Laura fell silent, tears streaming from her eyes. She had no idea that Obi, her mother, had written this love message. Tiffany's sob broke her reverie, her friend's eyes were also moist. How romantic, Tiffany said. Laura, who is this Alex? Your mom's admirer? She never told anyone about this. I was 10 when she wrote this letter. My dad died before I was born. Maybe they met later. My mom loved my dad very much, she never looked at anyone else. Who is this mysterious Alex anyway? Tiffany shrugged, and Laura fell into thought. The letter says it's not the first one written and not sent. Maybe there are others. Well, in the books, let's look for them. Cleaning can wait. They spent 3 hours, and it was already dark outside, with rain turning into a downpour. However, there were 2 more letters on the table in front of them. One was found in Dante's Divine Comedy, and the other in a volume of Tism and Thiva's poems. With trembling hands, Laura unfolded the first sheet. It was 5 years older, with the same address. The handwriting also belonged to her mother, but it was more youthful, with flowing curly lines. It was evident that a young girl had written it. My beloved, another year has passed without you. It's unbearable for me to think that you are so far away, that there is another woman beside you. I know your mother dreamed of this wedding, but what torment her dreams cost me. Don't look for me, I lost myself a long time ago. Forever yours, Obi. Laura finished reading, and an awkward silence hung in the air. Now I don't understand anything at all, Tiffany rubbed her temples. Another year, Laura repeated. Another one. So everything happened before, but how? I didn't know anything about this. My head is spinning. Read the second one. Tiffany impatiently fidgeted on the couch. Laura unfolded the last letter. The handwriting had become different, tired, and sad. July 20th, 2018. In a week, my mother passed away. The girl closed her eyes, suddenly feeling scared. What would she discover in the scrap of paper? What secret would this final message reveal to her? My dear Alex, this is my last letter. The hope of looking into your eyes again, alas, will never come true. 28 long years without you have drained me of strength and the will to fight. I cannot convey how deeply I regret listening to reason and other people when I left your life. Perhaps you will never know that I returned home with a priceless gift, for the sake of which I tried to be happy all these years. It's our daughter, the result of that incredible and endless love that has forever resided in my heart. Yes, I am guilty before you for hiding, running away, and disappearing from your life. I deprived you of the joy of being a father to Lara, and her of paternal care and love. Now I understand how foolishly I lived my life, causing pain to myself, you, and little Lara. She knows nothing, and I have no strength to tell her. Forgive me and farewell, the love of my life. Forever yours, Obi. The girl sat in silence, staring into the void. The truth had unfolded so unexpectedly and harshly that they couldn't find the right words. Laura struggled to grasp what she had just read. Just yesterday morning, she was peacefully baking cookies in her countryside kitchen. Everything in life was predetermined, clear, and predictable. No secrets, no betrayals, no letters. It felt like years had passed since that moment. Well, what should I do now? Laura broke the silence. She was holding the precious sheets of paper that held the secret of her existence. Tiffany, who is this Alex? Her friend met her gaze seriously. Lara, do you realize what you just learned? You found out that you have a real father who doesn't know about you. What can you do about it? Laura looked up at her. I really want to find him, but maybe he's already, think positive. Tiffany interrupted her. And it turns out you're half German, she chuckled, seeing her friend's amusement. Lara couldn't help but smile. Over the next hour, they finished cleaning and discussed grand plans for reuniting the family. A couple of days later, Lara sat across from Henry at a huge table in the lawyer's office, signing divorce papers. Thanks to Ms. Amelie's connections, she became a free woman in just 3 days. As a result of the divorce, she retained her personal belongings, some valuables, and a sense of her own dignity, which she proudly carried to Tiffany's workplace along with a bottle of champagne and a box of Ferrero Rocher chocolates. Well, that's it, Lara sighed when her friend met her at the publishing house's entrance. 9 years of marriage are now in the past. Tiffany hugged her tightly. Well, that's a relief. I never liked him anyway. That was the unvarnished truth. The mutual antipathy between Lara's husband and her friend always left Lara utterly puzzled. We have 40 minutes until the end of the workday. Will you wait? Tiffany led her into her office, which was filled with a million manuscripts scattered everywhere. Yes, I have nowhere to hurry, Lara playfully replied, making herself comfortable on a small couch. She liked the atmosphere of Tiffany's office. It was a place of creativity. Thousands of small font scribbled papers held numerous stories, thoughts, and experiences. A heap of new names, addresses, brochures, and notes were scattered here and there. On the computer monitor, the CPU, and the closet wall, Amadeus Publishing was considered one of the best in the region, and Tiffany, with her artistic taste and innate literacy, found her calling as an editor there. Lara, on the other hand, had graduated with a degree in landscape design and had dreamed of creating landscaping masterpieces somewhere in a warm place where there were no cold and snowstorms. Instead, she became a lonely, unemployed homemaker. Yes, and divorced, to top it all off. These thoughts soured her mood. She picked up the first manuscript she found on Tiffany's desk and unintentionally got engrossed in it. Hey, Earth to Lara, she heard Tiffany's voice right next to her ear. Tiffany was already dressed in her chlamys, as Lara jokingly called her favorite cashmere poncho, and held Lara's coat in her hands. The friends exited the bustling publishing house and plunged into the thick October twilight. The first stars had already appeared in the sky, which was dark and clear, with no hint of rain. The air smelled of damp leaves and wet asphalt. The city around them carried on with its usual life, completely indifferent to other people's problems. It leisurely prepared for winter, shedding the last remnants of clothing from the sprawling maples in the Central Park and bidding farewell to flocks of migratory birds. Clicking the lock, Laura opened the door to her mother's apartment, and now a completely different scent filled the air. Boxes of clothes were scattered everywhere, emanating the fragrance of Lara's favorite perfume, along with shoes and cosmetics. However, there wasn't much of the latter since the girl preferred a more natural look. The refrigerator in the kitchen rumbled with half-filled food, and a vase on the table held a picturesque still life of grapes. The girls ordered pizza, and when it arrived, they uncorked the champagne. "To your new life," Tiffany proposed, raising her glass for a short but meaningful toast. "For the search for my father," Laura added thoughtfully, and they clinked glasses and sipped the sparkling liquid. "By the way, what are your plans? Are you going to look for a job?" Tiffany popped a grape into her mouth. "First, I'm going to find my father. I just don't know where to start. I don't even have a visa, and my passport is probably expired. Besides, I need to figure out what kind of capital I have to work with now. I think I should visit a pawn shop." Tiffany squinted her eyes. "A pawn shop? Do you want to sell the trinkets your ex-husband gave you?" "Yes, for now, I don't have any other options. I have a couple of thousand in cash in my wallet, the same on my card. And what should I do with them? There are plenty of expenses, utilities, groceries, transportation, not to mention the money needed for getting a new passport, visas, and buying tickets." Laura took a sip of champagne. "Well, I can't help much with money, of course, but I can give you valuable advice." Laura looked at her friend questioningly, and Tiffany gazed directly into her eyes. "Call Ronald." Laura choked on her champagne. "Are you out of your mind? What's wrong with that?" "It's been so many years," Tiffany asked. Laura shrugged. I basically just left him." Laura had experienced what they call first love with Ronald. It was a delightful year, their 11th grade notes and notebooks, glances, secret smiles, long evening walks, their first kisses in the autumn rain when he walked her home after the autumn ball exactly 13 years ago. And then there was graduation, their first adult dance together. All these images flashed suddenly before Lara's eyes like scenes from a movie. An unwelcome lump formed in her throat. They had parted so abruptly. Lara had been accepted into the State Institute of Design, and Ronald had enrolled in the Academy of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The distance, late-night calls, and infrequent meetings during vacations, unanswered and sometimes unread text messages, had made it clear to the girl that it was over. A year later, Ronald's parents died in a car accident, and his younger sister was taken to the village by their grandmother, and his visits to his hometown ceased completely. Both of them had embarked on new lives, and Lara had met Henry, handsome, intelligent, and from a good family. Only, Miss Obi regretted that Henry had become her son-in-law instead of Ronald. Once, they did meet again, and that encounter almost drove Lara insane. It was on her wedding day. There was a knock on the door, then she heard her mother gasp in the hallway. Fiddling with the ties on her wedding dress, she stepped out of the room and froze. Her first love stood before her with a huge bouquet of roses. They looked at each other, living through those years of separation, regretting the lost time. Ronald didn't say a word, he simply handed her the flowers and left. Lara slumped down onto a stool in the hallway, feeling powerless. She closed her eyes. She had never experienced such pain. She wanted to take off her wedding dress and chase after him, but she didn't. "Laura, what are you thinking?" Tiffany's worried voice snapped her out of her memories. "Do you think he still remembers me?" she asked hopefully, looking at her friend. Tiffany put her hands on Lara's shoulders and smiled. "I'm sure he does. If you want to know, he's not even married yet." "Oh," Laura dismissed. "How do you know that?" "I know, we sometimes talk." "And you kept silent about it?" Lara shot her a glance, feeling a pang of jealousy. They had maintained contact all these years. "Well, why not? You were happy with your husband, a home, a household, and plans to have children. Why dwell on old wounds? She was right, of course, but Lara felt a twinge of jealousy. They had stayed in touch all these years. Did he ask about me? Emotions overwhelmed Lara, and try as she might, she couldn't hide them. Tiffany shook her head disapprovingly. You, forbidden topic. So, he doesn't want to talk to me, let alone help? Lara sighed. Her friend encouragingly patted her hand. I don't think so. Call him. She took out her phone, and in the next moment, Ronald's contact appeared on Lara's screen. Thank you. Lara leaned forward and hugged Tiffany tightly. When they said their goodbyes, it was almost midnight. Thankfully, tomorrow was Saturday, otherwise, Tiffany would have had to mope at work all day. Lying in bed, Lara absent-mindedly twirled her phone in her hands. She was scared to dial the number, but the overwhelming desire to hear his voice couldn't be ignored. His face from their last meeting appeared before her, the pain and regret in his gray eyes. The lips that had once kissed her so passionately now turned into a thin line of resentment and disappointment. Oh, she remembered that expression so well. His deep gaze had left a huge scar in her heart. Finally exhausted, she drifted into a deep, restless sleep. She dreamed of her mother, school, Ronald. Scenes and memories intertwined in a kaleidoscope of events. The next morning, she woke up with a terrible headache, blaming it on the champagne from the night before. She quickly showered and poured herself a cup of coffee. Sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her, she stared at it for about 10 minutes. Then finally mustered the courage to dial his number. I hope he doesn't pick up, she thought to herself. Hello, a voice with a husky quality that sent shivers down her spine answered. Lara's palms grew sweaty, and she nearly dropped the phone. What should she say? Hi, Ronald. A long pause followed, and Lara thought she might hear the sound of a disconnected call any moment. It seemed like he recognized her. Laura, is that you? It's me, she replied, not knowing what else to say. I didn't expect to hear from you. Ronald's voice was calm and composed. How are you? Good, how about you? Lara struggled to catch her breath. Her heart was racing. Could have been better, Ronald muttered, then got straight to the point. So, what's happened with you? What do you mean? Lara didn't understand. I mean in the sense that we haven't talked in 13 years, and suddenly you're calling me. In that sense, she repeated, feeling foolish. A lot has happened, she added impulsively before her brain could react. Can we meet? She instantly regretted it, feeling anxious. There was a short pause, then he replied, when and where? In the cafe under the maples, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Is that okay? That works. See you tomorrow, Ronald said before hanging up. Lara stared at the buzzing phone as if it had sprouted ears. Had she really just set up a meeting? Yes. Did he agree? Yes. Her tea had grown cold. She poured it down the sink and mechanically washed the cup before putting it in the fridge. What's wrong with you? Tiffany squealed with delight when Lara told her about the morning call with Ronald. They were sitting in Lara's kitchen again, sipping instant coffee with warm milk, the concoction Tiffany despised, but the previous day Lara had bought a milk frother and whipped up a frothy milk topping, sprinkling it with a touch of cinnamon. The ordinary black liquid was transformed into an appetizing drink. That's how it is, Lara said, blushing. We have a meeting tomorrow. Good for you, Tiffany congratulated her. She took a sip, and the foam left little mustaches above her upper lip. So, what will you wear? Lara shrugged. I haven't thought about it, to be honest. Think about it. You need to look stunning at the very least, and at the most, Lara laughed. At the most, I should look like the woman he can't live without. The man sitting at the cafe table was so familiar to Lara that she had to swallow the lump in her throat. His tall, lean figure, handsome masculine face, gray eyes, and dimples when he smiled, those hands that once held her and caressed her. Lara realized she was sweating. Hadn't time healed anything over the years? She was surprised at herself. She had felt confident just a minute ago, but now all that self-assuredness had vanished. Dressed in tight jeans, a boho-style shirt, and suede boots, she had felt confident until a moment ago. However, she mustered up her courage and approached his table. Seeing her, Ronald paused for a moment, then stood up to greet her. "Hi," Ronald awkwardly began. "Hello, Lara," she smiled. "Thank you for coming." He was dressed in jeans and a shirt, but his shirt was more formal, and his gaze remained as piercing as ever. They sat across from each other, and an awkward silence hung between them. Lara knew he was waiting for her to explain, but she couldn't find the words. Ronald was looking at her as if she were the only person in the world. Well, she had to gather her courage. "Are you waiting for an explanation?" she finally asked. He just shrugged. "By the way, these are for you," he said, handing her a bouquet of daisies. "Where did you get these?" "It's October," she exclaimed in surprise. "Lara, you're hilarious," he laughed. "Besides it being October, we're also in the 21st century, right?" she mumbled and smiled. "So, what did you want to tell me?" Ronald leaned back in his chair. "Or should we order something first?" "Let's order," Lara agreed. She felt a bit more relaxed. She had forgotten what it was like to be close to him, to talk to him, to see him smile and squint his eyes. A waitress came over and took their order for 2 lattes and a couple of blueberry cheesecakes. Once they were alone again, Ronald looked at her. "Well, speak up." "I'm getting nervous myself." Lara raised her eyes and was startled when his hand gently covered hers. She felt a wave of heat rush through her body, either from embarrassment and fear or from a sudden rush of excitement. "I got divorced the day before yesterday," she blurted out. She had wanted to say something completely different. "I already know," he simply replied, his hand still resting on hers. "Well, there's no point in talking about the past since you're aware of it, I assume," she said. "So, let's get to the main point. Do you remember me talking about my father?" He nodded. "Well, it's all a lie. He wasn't an engineer like my mother claimed. He was a foreigner, specifically German, whom my mother met when she was young. They fell in love, she got pregnant, and left him for reasons I don't know. He knows nothing about me, and I know nothing about him. I only found out a couple of days ago when I discovered my mother's letters to him that she never sent." Ronald listened attentively, nodding as Lara continued. "I only have an address and the name Alex Schwarzenberg," she explained. "That's not nothing," Ronald replied. "Have you tried looking on social media?" "Yes, but I couldn't find anything that matched." "So, you want me to use my official channels to try and dig up this information?" She nodded. Ronald suddenly looked a bit sad. "So, was I wrong to hope that you just wanted to see me?" he asked. She blushed. "Of course, I wanted to see you, but I was ashamed. I was afraid you held a grudge and wouldn't forgive me." He looked at her, and his eyes sparkled. "I forgave you a long time ago," he confessed. "In fact, I shouldn't have been upset. I was the one at fault in our breakup, but I was so overwhelmed, everything came crashing down on me, my studies, the loss of my parents, and taking care of Samantha, since she was practically in my arms, and my grandmother was already ill. I didn't consider that you also needed attention. I thought you'd wait for as long as I needed. I had no right to think that way." A treacherous tear rolled down Lara's cheek as if a heavy boulder had been lifted from her soul after his confession. "I waited, Ronald. When you disappeared completely, I thought you didn't need me anymore, so I decided to move on. But when you came on the day of my wedding, I wanted to run after you, but I didn't because of Henry, because of my mom." He gazed at her with the same intensity he had 13 years ago, and it was just as mesmerizing. Their order arrived, providing a welcome distraction. Lara took a sip of her coffee. "Lara," Ronald said with a smile as he looked out the window at the dimming sky, "you haven't changed at all. I kept an eye on you. We often spoke with Tiffany during these years, and she spilled everything about you, even though I didn't ask, and for that, I'm eternally grateful. We'll find your father, I promise. It'll just take some time. I'm not working in law enforcement right now." Why? Raised her eyebrows in surprise. But you dreamed of it since the first grade. I worked there for a while, but not for long. My grandmother passed away, Samantha got sick with cancer, and I had to quit my job to dedicate all my time to her. Besides my sister, I don't have anyone else, Ronald explained. Laura was stunned. She remembered Ronald's younger sister very well, a rosy-cheeked girl with blonde braids and silver gray eyes. Samantha has cancer, she repeated the word as if in disbelief. Ronald nodded. Sarcoma. She needs a bone marrow transplant, but it costs an astronomical amount of money. I took out a loan for her maintenance therapy, but my job as a security guard doesn't cover all the expenses. But you don't have to worry about it, he warned Laura. Oh my God, Ronald, I want to help with something, he shook his head. I'm afraid there's nothing you can do. But can I visit her? Can I come over to your place? Do you want to come over, really? Ronald asked skeptically. Of course, Laura brightened up. If you don't mind. He smiled and touched the rim of the latte glass with a cooling drink. I'm not against it, but Samantha might not be thrilled. Why? Wondered, but then understood. Ah, I see. I'll think of something to say. Well then, we can go right now if you're free, of course. I have the day off today, and I promised Samantha a walk in the park. I'm free then. Let's go. He put a bill on the table and extended his hand to Laura. Ronald confidently headed towards the exit, and Laura, clutching the marguerites and her purse, hurried to follow him. Neither of them touched the cheesecakes. When they got into Ronald's car, Laura asked him to stop by her place first. There, she retrieved her favorite Italian scarf from the closet and placed it in a bag before darting out of her apartment. Where are we going? She asked in bewilderment as they passed by the street where Ronald had lived before, out of town. Ronald replied, activating the turn signal. When Samantha got sick, we sold our parents' apartment and bought a small house in the suburban area to be closer to nature. There's fresh air, a river, it's beautiful. He glanced briefly at his companion. Did you change your mind about coming? Ronald asked. No, of course not, just asking, Laura replied. Laura felt a bit awkward and stared out the window for most of the way to the village. They drove in silence. Finally, Ronald's car stopped in front of a small house covered in white siding and surrounded by a white wooden fence. It seemed like autumn had left all its charm right here, in the withering grass of the front yard covered in fallen leaves, in the fiery red mountain ash by the porch, and in the scent of ripe Antonoff apples, which Laura could smell as soon as she stepped out of the car. A birch tree near the fence, adorned in gold and copper, extended its branches like a welcoming hand of a departing September. Ronald opened the gate, allowing his guests to enter first. A massive shaggy dog bounded out with joyful barking. Laura screamed in surprise, and the dog enthusiastically sniffed her hands, which were clutching the bag. Look, he recognizes you, Ronald chuckled as he patted the dog's withers. And you, he asked Laura, do you recognize him? Laura crouched down next to the wagging tail of the dog. Sherlock, really? How old is he now? 14, she remembered when they used to walk together with the still very young puppy along the embankment in the park. He had changed a lot since then, but one thing remained the same, his easygoing nature and cheerful disposition. Laura hugged Sherlock's shaggy head and smiled. Nostalgia suddenly washed over her like a sweet wave. She and Ronald petted Sherlock and looked at each other. Do we have guests? A female voice came from somewhere. The young people raised their heads simultaneously. Standing on the porch, in a warm fleece suit and a knit hat, was a very frail pale girl. The dark circles under her eyes and her vacant gaze indicated severe illness. Hello, Samantha, Laura greeted her, standing up and smiling. For about 10 seconds, Samantha stared at her, then turned and went back into the house. Pay no attention to her, Ronald reassured Laura. I'll be right back. Stay here for a minute. He briskly walked towards the house and disappeared behind the door, leaving Laura feeling inexplicably lonely. Sherlock first poked her with his wet nose, then simply lay down at her feet. It seemed he had exhausted all his strength in greeting an old acquaintance and was now stretched out, huffing and puffing heavily across the path. It had gotten colder out of nowhere. A gust of wind brought an unpleasant chill, and Lara regretted not wearing a hat. Her leather jacket didn't have a hood either. But then the door opened, and Ronald saw her shivering. He practically scooped her up and dragged her into the house. "You're freezing." "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I just had to tell her," he said while standing in the entryway, rubbing her forearms and looking at her with such longing that Lara suddenly felt warm. With an unexpected burst of courage, she wrapped her arms around his neck and, standing on tiptoes, pressed her lips to his. He responded immediately to the kiss, at first gently and tentatively, then more ardently, with passion. They probably stood there in the entryway, making up for lost time. But then the door opened, and a teasing voice rang out, "Would you two please come in already?" Oh my God, there was a thud and then silence. Clearly, Samantha had realized what she interrupted them and hurriedly retreated. Lara reluctantly pulled away from Ronald's lips and hid her face against his neck. Suddenly, she felt like laughing and jumping around. He stood there, holding her by the waist and breathing heavily. "What are you doing? Trying to kill me?" he whispered into her hair. "Do you want me to have a heart attack?" She just shook her head in denial. "Okay, let's go," Ronald grinned. "Otherwise, Samantha will finish me off." They walked into a small hallway that smelled of fresh firewood and something delicious that reminded Lara of her childhood at her grandmother's house. "We need to stoke the stove, it's cold inside," Samantha said, looking directly at Lara. "Please come in." Lara nodded and followed her into the room, where the host of the house was busy loading logs into a large Dutch oven standing in the middle of the room. "Hello," Samantha said as she looked at Lara. "Come on in." Lara nodded and sat down on the creaky couch. Both women burst into laughter, and the ice was broken. "It's just as beautiful here as ever," Samantha commented amicably, joining the conversation and walking over to them. "Thank you, and you're just as lovely," Lara replied with a smile, taking in her surroundings as she settled onto the creaky couch. They both laughed, and the tension dissipated. Soon, the room was filled with the sounds of crackling firewood. Lara looked around. In the room where they were sitting, there were two more doors, presumably leading to bedrooms. The modest furnishings and the overall atmosphere spoke of a simple and peaceful life. Among the modern items, she noticed a TV, a vacuum cleaner in the corner behind the Dutch oven, and a mobile phone charging on a shelf. The entire setting transported her to a tranquil place. Misinterpreting her gaze, Ronald explained, "Selling the apartment, we bought this little house because it was quite affordable, and we used the remaining money for Samantha's surgery and a few rounds of chemotherapy." Ronald explained, "You haven't been to the kitchen yet." Samantha chuckled and spread a tablecloth on the table. "Let's eat already, I'm hungry." "Today, you're not allowed to stand by the stove," her older brother frowned. "What did you cook there?" "I didn't cook, I just put chicken with potatoes in the oven." "So don't get too excited, there won't be any foie gras today." She turned around briskly and disappeared through the doorway. Lara got up from the couch. "I'll go help her." "It's great that she hasn't lost her sense of humor," she said, smiling at Ronald, meeting his grateful gaze. She headed for Samantha. They had lunch quietly in a family-like manner, whispering to each other and teasing. As Lara remembered that she hadn't come empty-handed, she handed Samantha an Italian silk scarf. Samantha thanked her warmly and, taking off her knitted hat, headed to the mirror to try it on. They watched in silence as her slender fingers deftly tied an intricate knot on her head, and she returned to the table as a completely different person, feminine, content, and even with a hint of blush on her cheeks. Lara didn't realize how time had flown, and outside, dusk was settling in, accompanied by intensifying rain. Ronald stared at her as if wanting to say something. "It's getting late," Lara met his gaze. "I need to go home." "I'll drive you," he said, sounding disappointed. "Just let me warm up the car." Stay with us. Samantha grabbed her hand. You don't have anywhere to be tomorrow, right? Ronald froze halfway to the door, and Lara felt torn. On one hand, she really wanted to stay. On the other, she was afraid of rushing things after all. They had just reunited. After a moment of hesitation, she spoke. No, I can't stay tonight. Maybe some other time. How about you come over to my place? It's smaller, but between us girls, we'll find a place for you to sleep. Seeing that her persuasion was in vain, Ronald headed out to the porch, and Samantha looked disappointed. Lara added, trying to lift her spirits, Don't worry, we'll see each other again soon. As Ronald warmed up the car, Samantha held Lara's hand. Lara, don't let him go again, do you hear me? The young woman stopped and stared at her with wide eyes. He still loves you. If you don't plan to be with him, leave now and don't come back. He won't survive a second time, she said sternly. Lara suddenly realized that this was a moment of truth where she couldn't lie, be cowardly, or evade the question. It was straightforward and demanded an honest answer. I won't hurt him, never. I love him too, just don't tell him, not yet, she replied sincerely. Samantha nodded, her face relaxing, and she released Lara's hand. Ronald returned to the car, and they started driving again. Rain pelted against the windshield, and the radio murmured. They drove on the slippery road, and the atmosphere inside the car felt charged to the maximum. Suddenly, Ronald reduced his speed, pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the ignition, and engaged the handbrake. Then he moved closer to Lara, pulled her towards him by her neck, and kissed her passionately. She surrendered herself to his power over her. Her hand slipped under his jacket and stopped where her heart was pounding furiously. Her own heart, pounding against her ribs, seemed like it could leap out of her chest at any moment. Finally, Ronald pulled away from her, and it was as if those years had never passed. Almost breathless, he whispered, How much I wish those years never happened. Lara lost her ability to think, she just gazed into his eyes and melted into him. It's true what they say about first love being the strongest, the most unforgettable. In her case, it was also the only one. They looked at each other, getting closer again. He was about to kiss her lips once more, erasing the sweet memories when a phone call interrupted them. After 5 seconds of processing what was happening, Lara realized that her phone was ringing in her bag. She picked up the receiver and heard Tiffany's angry voice. My God, Lara, what is going on? I've been trying to reach you all day. Tiffany calmed down, I'm perfectly fine. Hi there, Laura greeted her friend with a smile. Happy for you, her friend said sarcastically. I nearly had a heart attack. You're not home, not answering the phone. What should I do? Where are you anyway? I'm with Ronald. There was a brief pause. Well then, Tiffany's voice noticeably softened. You're forgiven. Say hello and call when you have time. Just don't take too long. And she hung up. Lara smiled at Ronald, shrugging her shoulders. I heard everything, he laughed. I almost went deaf. Why did she get so worked up? She's worried about me, Lara replied. Let's go. Ronald started the engine, and they leisurely drove on the wet road. Near the door of her apartment, they kissed again. When she invited him inside, he declined because she didn't want to leave her sister alone for too long. After recording Alex Schwarzenberg's information and address in the hallway, he said goodbye to Lara and left. Once back home, Lara quickly took a shower, jumped into bed, and dialed Tiffany's number. She told her about the day's events, and Tiffany listened attentively, occasionally interjecting phrases like, Wow, I can't believe it. They chatted for about an hour until a text message arrived from Ronald. Thank you for this day. Laura smiled to herself and closed her eyes, instantly falling asleep. The pawn shop was quiet, apart from the ticking of the large antique clock standing near the counter. As decoration, there was hardly any noise. Under the glass on the display, there were various items, from earrings and rings to cameras and dash cams brought in by people in need of cash. Lara felt extremely uncomfortable and uncertain. In her bag, she had everything she had received from Henry after their divorce. She and Tiffany were supposed to meet at her place because she was afraid to walk around with such valuable items. But her friend got held up at work. She simply felt too embarrassed to call Ronald. Behind the counter, a dry, bespectacled man with thick lenses resembling a leprechaun greeted her. She laid out everything she had brought: a pair of gold earrings with diamonds, a platinum ring with a sprinkling of tiny emeralds, gold watches, and finally, her wedding ring. It wasn't worth much, but Lara didn't want to part with it. Suddenly, the entrance door slammed shut, and she was relieved to see Tiffany, out of breath. "Hi," she literally rolled into the pawn shop, hastily folding her umbrella and shaking herself off like a soaked dog. "What a weather." "Hi," Lara waved to her. "You're just in time." The man behind the counter nervously glanced at the door, obviously thinking that someone else might come in. Tiffany guessed his thoughts and, leaning familiarly on the counter, said in a mockingly low voice, "No, that's it, we're not expecting anyone else." "Well, great," the man snorted. "Let's get started." Half an hour later, the girls walked out into the pouring rain, feeling satisfied and pleasantly surprised. The money they received for the jewelry should be enough for the time being. Without work, for the search for their father, and for a trip to Germany. "That's the payment for my unsuccessful family life," Laura joked, hugging her purse with the money. A taxi, ordered by Tiffany, stopped near them, and the friends hurried to it. While they were on their way to Lara's apartment, Ronald called. "Hey," she heard his low voice on the phone. "Hi." The girl didn't notice how her face automatically lit up with a smile. Tiffany rolled her eyes and turned to the window. "Lara, there's news about your father." "So soon?" She was surprised. Yes, there was silence on the phone, and Lara felt a chill inside. "Is he dead?" "No, what are you thinking?" "He's alive." Tears suddenly welled up in Lara's eyes. Her hands were trembling so much that she was afraid of dropping the phone. "Can you come and tell me everything?" "Yes, but only in a couple of hours. I need to take Samantha her medicine." "Okay, thank you." Tiffany looked worriedly at her friend. "Well, what is it?" "What did he say, Tiffany?" "He's alive." Lara laughed through her tears. "My father is alive." The friend looked at her and tears suddenly welled up in her eyes too. Continuing to cry, the girls hugged, and the taxi driver looked puzzled in the rearview mirror, pondering whether to say something encouraging to them or stay out of this complicated matter. The girls sat in the kitchen, and on the table in front of them stood a bottle of wine. Time seemed to drag on endlessly, so when the doorbell rang, they both jumped up. "Oh, Tiffany, hi." Ronald smiled when they opened the door for him. "What's going on?" He paused, looking at the excited faces of the girls. "Come in quickly," Tiffany ordered. "Don't tease us, we're dying of impatience." The young man squeezed into the narrow hallway, which seemed to have shrunk in size, and began taking off his shoes. As soon as he straightened up, Tiffany pushed him into the kitchen and seated him at the table. When Ronald saw the wine bottle, he smirked. "It seems I've missed everything." Both girls looked at him with such a gaze that he quickly opened the folder in his hand and pulled out several sheets of paper filled with small print. Handing them to Lara, he said, "Here you go, princess, a big surprise awaits you." Lara cautiously took the documents and sat down on a chair. Suddenly her strength left her, and her head spun. "Oh, don't worry so much," Tiffany whispered. "Read it," and she began to read. Extract from the Registry of Noble Families in Germany, Alex Manfred von Schwarzenberg, a prince in the 12th generation. Date of birth, June 12, 1961. Place of birth, Reynoldsfeld, City of Trier, Germany. Parents, Hans Friedrich von Schwarzenberg and Brigitte Elisabeth von Schwarzenberg, born Kaiser. Higher education in the humanities, specializing in international relations. Following that were numerous dates and names, events and documents that told a brief history of Prince von Schwarzenberg's life. Laura stopped reading. She was confused and bewildered. Her father a prince, and not just any prince, but in the 12th generation. Unbelievable. "Oh my goodness, how could my mother hide all this from me?" she thought bitterly. Tiffany broke the silence in the kitchen. Yes, you should be addressed as Your Highness now, nothing less. She chuckled. Tiffany, stop it. I can't believe this. Is this all true? She turned to Ronald. He nodded affirmatively. Are there any photos? She asked hopefully. Unfortunately, no. That's all I could find. Oh my God, Lara exclaimed. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you. You're welcome, he replied, but he suddenly looked a bit downcast. He watched as she absorbed the news about her heritage and suddenly thought that there might not be a place for him in her life again. But Ronald said, clapping his hands on his knees and getting up from his stool, if I'm no longer needed, I'll go. Lara anxiously grabbed his hand. Tiffany tactfully left the kitchen. Don't go, please, Lara. He looked directly into her eyes. I'm not a fool. I know that you'll now go looking for your father, and that's the right thing to do, but you won't come back here. You'll leave me again, and I don't want to suffer from missing you again. Let me go now, please. She looked at him. I can't lose you again like last time, and if you leave now, I'll follow you, and I don't care how it looks. At that moment they heard the slam of the front door. Tiffany had gone home, leaving them alone. Stood in front of Lara, unable to believe what she had just said. She looked at him with such openness and sincerity, her lips slightly parted, her cheeks flushed. Lara, don't tempt me. Ronald pressed his forehead to hers. You understand that I still can't breathe evenly when you're around. I can say the same, she whispered in response. Damn it, with you, break it again. What? The girl didn't understand. I mean, my heart, he nervously chuckled. I can't resist the joy of holding you in my arms right now, kissing you until you melt, just like our first time at the prom, remember? She nodded. After briefly stepping away, he picked her up and carried her into the room, gently placing her on the couch. Time stood still. It was as if there had been 13 years of separation, hurt feelings, and misunderstandings. There were only two lovers, a man and a woman, who desired each other so much that the world around them ceased to exist. This evening belonged solely to them. Whatever would happen next would happen. Getting a new passport and a Schengen visa took a month and a half. During this time, Lara and Ronald grew closer and hardly ever parted. Lara often went to the village and spent long hours with Samantha. Fortunately, the weather had become pleasant in late November. The days turned clear and frosty. Finally, a one-way ticket was purchased, Washington to Frankfurt, and Lara began packing her suitcases. As her departure date approached, Ronald became increasingly withdrawn and moody. He often didn't answer her calls and disappeared somewhere. Then one day he showed up at Lara's place completely drunk. She had never seen him like that before. Without saying a word, she put him to sleep on the couch and sat there for a long time, gazing at his familiar face. Deep down she understood the reason for his behavior, but she couldn't change anything. She had been eagerly anticipating this trip, and he should have understood her feelings. After all, it was about her father. The next morning when Ronald woke up, he apologized profusely and left without even kissing her goodbye. Her departure was scheduled for December 23rd, and Ronald offered to drive her to Washington in his car. Lara didn't object as she wanted to spend more time with him, talk and reassure him. She wanted to convince him that she would return as soon as she got to know her father better. The tension between them in the last few days had become unbearable. Ronald was like a dark cloud, brooding and taciturn, and the night before her departure, he had grabbed her in the elevator and held her so tightly that she thought her ribs would break. That night they made love with wild passion, as if it were the last time, and in the morning he became distant once again. Lara was deeply upset by this. She also worried about how Ronald would react to the envelope of money she had left for Samantha the day before. The amount wasn't large, but it would cover a month's worth of medication expenses. When they said goodbye to her, Lara made her boyfriend's sister swear not to tell Ronald anything until after her departure. Samantha, you know I'll come back. She earnestly looked into her boyfriend's sister's eyes. I won't leave you. She only nodded and hugged Lara tightly, sobbing, as they said their goodbyes. The journey to Washington took them 10 hours. During that entire time, they barely exchanged a dozen sentences. Ronald stared tensely at the road, holding Lara's hand tightly. Words were unnecessary. They both understood. They arrived in Washington at 3 in the morning. The flight was scheduled for 6. The airport, as always, was bustling with people of all kinds. In the dreadful crowd, Lara and Ronald made their way with their suitcases to the check-in counter. They had only a few minutes left to say their goodbyes. Ronald looked at Laura with sadness in his eyes. "Lara, you're slipping away again," he said sadly. "I'll come back, I promise." She passionately embraced him, standing on her tiptoes and pressing her lips to his, their breaths mingling. The flight was announced, and Lara, tearing herself away from him with difficulty, wiping away unwanted tears, headed towards her past. In the plane, she calmed down a bit and prepared herself for the flight. It would take 3 hours to reach Frankfurt, and she had time to think about her actions. The thought that she might be an unwelcome guest in her father's house again sent shivers down her spine. He didn't know that his beloved had been pregnant, and more importantly, that he now had an adult daughter. Maybe he was happily married and had other children, and it was quite possible that she had brothers and sisters. The engines roared to life, the plane took off, gaining altitude, and carried Lara away from Ronald, straight into the unknown, she thought. Frankfurt Airport, the largest in Europe, resembled an anthill, countless terminals, floors, and check-in counters. Everything around was dressed up for Christmas, and every waiting area even had photo zones with Santa Claus. Lara thought about Ronald, who was now heading back to the village. Taking out her phone, she tried to catch Wi-Fi to send him a message on WhatsApp. After connecting to the network, she typed a short message, "I've landed already, miss you." An immediate reply from Ronald came, "I miss you too." The response seemed dry and monosyllabic, instantly dampening her mood. However, she gathered herself and went to collect her luggage, not forgetting to send a message to Tiffany as well. From the airport, she took a taxi to the train station, where she boarded a commuter train. She would have several transfers along the way, and she was fighting off sleep. After all, she had spent the previous night on the road, plus the flight had tired her, and the anxieties associated with the trip had taken a toll. Sitting by the window, she watched the unfamiliar landscapes pass by, rocky hills dotted with tunnels and covered in dense forests, windmills, valleys with clusters of tiny villages, rivers with ducks and swans swimming, industrial zones with massive warehouses and hangars, ancient castle ruins on hilltops, and old Catholic churches with tiled roofs. Lara had always loved the unique charm of old Europe with its quaint houses, lush greenery, and the friendliness of the locals. Everything was in order here, as if the residents were preparing for an important guest's arrival. In the train carriage where Lara was traveling, it was crowded. Most of the passengers were young people in jeans, various jackets, and Christmas hats, as well as people from East Asia and who knows where else. After 2 transfers, Lara finally boarded a train to Trier. Unfortunately, she hadn't arranged for accommodation in advance, and she was absolutely exhausted. Right now, she needed a shower, a comfortable place to rest, and some time to collect her thoughts before heading to the address she had. On top of it all, she was starving. She had last eaten on the plane, and it had been quite a few hours since then. She walked out of the train station into the city's twilight. She took in a breath of the cool winter air and thought about how, somewhere in the city thousands of kilometers away from her home, her father lived, the only blood relative she had. In her bag were letters from her mother and a sapphire ring, just in case he didn't believe her. Thinking that she needed a place to stay, she asked a kind-looking woman at a bus stop where the nearest hotel was. About 20 minutes later, she found herself at the reception desk of a small hotel not far from the train station. After getting the room key from the concierge, she asked if it was possible to order dinner in her room. With an affirmative answer, she headed to the elevator. On the 3rd floor, tired and hungry, Lara found her room and practically stumbled inside, dragging her suitcases behind her. She shed her coat and shoes and collapsed onto the large double bed, which was adorned with a lilac blanket. For a good 5 minutes, she caught her breath and tried to calm the whirlwind of thoughts in her head. The room was modest but clean and tidy, decorated in shades of lilac and lavender, furnished with modern ivory-colored furniture. It reminded Lara of Provence, where she had once visited with her ex-husband. The girl quickly took a shower, where she happily discovered soft slippers and a fluffy terry cloth robe. After putting on the robe, she went to answer the door when they brought her dinner. She devoured the French fries, the chicken fried with mushrooms, and the asparagus salad. Holding a cup of aromatic tea in her hands, she stepped out onto the small balcony, hidden behind the curtain. In front of her stretched an empty alley, illuminated by fancy street lamps. Leaning over it, Trier wasn't a big city, but the streets were bustling everywhere. Christmas lights sparkled and shimmered, bells jingled, and music played. Lara thought that it was a magical time. The atmosphere was so fitting, symbolizing the beginning of something new and good in her life. She returned to her room and laid down on the bed. After reading her mother's letters once more, she held them close to her face, feeling that they still held the warmth and scent of the one who would never write anything to anyone ever again. Her eyes began to close, and with a tremendous effort, she reached for the light switch, plunging the room into darkness. When she opened her eyes again, the sun was already high, casting a bright strip of light across the parquet floor through the lilac curtains. Lara swung her legs off the bed, and barefoot, she shuffled to the window, pulling back the curtain. She let more light into the room and closed the balcony door. An icy draft rushed in, driving away the remnants of sleep from her face and replacing them with a rosy flush. Her feet froze immediately, and she quickly put on her slippers. Today is Christmas Eve, Lara thought, how symbolic. She took a shower, then took her time getting dressed, choosing an outfit, blow-drying her unruly curls, and applying makeup. After putting her mother's letters back in her bag, she put on her shoes and left the room. In the corridor, not far from the elevator, there was a large mirror, and Lara looked at her reflection with approval. She was wearing beige pleated trousers, a cashmere sweater to match, brown patent leather loafers with large buckles, and an Italian scarf with an ornament and tassels. Only her hairstyle added a touch of chaos to the elegant look. Her dark curls refused to behave neatly, but she thought it made her look more natural. Lara went downstairs and noticed a stand with tourist guides at the reception. She bought one, which came with a tourist map that she found to be incredibly detailed, marking all the streets, alleys, and buildings of the city with names and numbers. After going to the hotel's restaurant, she ordered herself a cappuccino. She wasn't hungry, as her nerves were getting the best of her, causing everything inside to tremble. She thought about Ronald. He was probably already at work or rushing with Samantha for another medical procedure. Deciding not to write anything to him for now, she started to study the map. It turned out that the address she needed was within walking distance, about half an hour away. The waitress brought her coffee, but Lara couldn't take a sip because of her overwhelming anxiety. She got up from the table, feeling a wave of relief as she stepped out onto the street. She was greeted by a beautiful European morning in all its festive splendor. She glanced at the map. It seemed she needed to first pass through a mysterious place called Porter Walk, a couple of blocks, and cross a pedestrian bridge over the Moselle River. According to the map, it was a stone's throw away from Luxembourg. Not surprising at all, everything in Europe seemed small. Lara smiled at her thoughts. Under different circumstances, she would have taken a leisurely stroll, but not today. After walking a few more streets, a couple of churches, and shopping centers, she arrived at a picturesque riverside area connected to the opposite bank by an old wide bridge. On the other side of the river, there were hills dotted with villas and mansions. Her father's house was among them. The Schwarzenberg residence was one of the most prominent in this little German Beverly Hills. In front of her, a massive tile stone wall covered in dried ivy stood with equally massive wrought iron gates in the middle. Beyond them was a garden or park, glistening with morning frost. The climate in these parts was quite mild, and Lara noticed that some trees in the city had already begun to bud. The historic house, with its tiled roof, was beautifully built in late Baroque style. Even in this season, surrounded by a garden stripped of its leaves and covered in dried ivy, it looked picturesque. She stood next to the gate and hesitated to ring the bell. Her father lived here, her ancestors lived here. This might be where the love story that brought her into this world began. A strange feeling enveloped Lara. She wanted to cry and laugh at the same time. Fear of the unknown stretched every nerve like a taut string. She noticed a man approaching on the gravel path. He appeared to be around 50 to 55 years old. He was fairly fit, with light-colored hair, and he had a small Yorkshire Terrier with him. Some intuition, a sixth sense, told her that he wasn't just a servant walking a dog. He wore light-colored trousers, a knitted sweater made of white wool, and a striped scarf. He reminded the girl of Harry Potter because he had round lensed glasses perched on his nose. Lara felt her pulse quicken at least twice as fast. She understood that this man was most likely her father, Alex Schwarzenberg. Lara stood by the gate, unable to move, while he noticed her and headed straight for the gate, his little dog scampering alongside him. He walked with confident, energetic strides, never taking his eyes off his guest. Stopping just a meter away from her, he froze. His still young and handsome face displayed a range of emotions: confusion, surprise, disbelief, and even fear. In that moment, Lara finally realized that the man standing before her was indeed her father. It was like looking into a mirror. He had the same facial features, the straight nose, cheekbones, eye shape, and even the shape of his lips. The only difference was that Alex Schwarzenberg had light hair and blue eyes, while Lara had inherited her dark curls and chocolate-colored eyes from her mother. "Can I help you with something?" the man asked uncertainly, still studying her face. Hoping her voice wouldn't tremble, Lara decided to ask, just in case. "I'd like to see Mr. Schwarzenberg. I have something to give him." The man opened the gate and walked towards her. "I'm Alex Schwarzenberg," he said, and extended his hand. Lara cautiously placed her fingers in his palm. "I apologize, but who are you?" he asked, looking at her expectantly. "I've come from America." Lara said those words and noticed the change in his expression. "My name is Laura Gilbert," she continued. He paled instantly. Clearly he remembered the surname that her mother and Lara herself used to have before she got married. "Please come in," he said, stepping aside to let her through the gate. They walked in silence until they reached the house. The dog trotted alongside, paying no attention to the guest. It seemed like the result of an aristocratic upbringing, where even dogs behaved decently in the presence of strangers. At the front door, a butler greeted them, and Alex instructed him to arrange for some refreshments and to summon Princess Birgit. So, there was a grandmother as well. Finally, they entered the hall. The surrounding splendor was blinding. Lara felt like she had walked into one of the German museums she had seen many of during her travels in the past. The old chandeliers, tapestries, vintage furniture made of expensive woods, and the deafening silence that was so profound that Lara could hear her own heartbeat surrounded them. "Please come to my office," Alex invited her. They entered a richly furnished room that resembled a library because bookshelves lined the entire perimeter of the room. Lara noticed that many of them didn't have titles on their spines, indicating their age. They were clearly very old. He gestured to a guest chair near his writing desk, then took a seat across from her. "So, you're Obi's relative?" he asked bluntly, right to the point. Lara realized there was no turning back, so she nodded affirmatively. "Is she here as well in Trier?" His voice carried a hint of hope that choked Lara with a bitter lump in her throat. "Unfortunately, she's not here. She passed away 2 years ago," Lara said. She saw a twitch in his face, and his eyes moistened. "She was also my mother," finally, she had said it. Alex stared at her with wide eyes. His neatly folded hands on the table were noticeably trembling. They both fell silent. Lara could see tears streaming down his cheeks. This man was crying for her mother, for their unlived life together, for their shared past, which obviously still haunted his memories. She felt grateful to him for that. He had loved her. He had waited for her. Lara suddenly realized she was crying too. They sat there facing each other, so alike in blood but complete strangers. Lara didn't know how much time had passed before he asked his question. "How old are you, Lara?" "August 1st, I turned 30, Lara whispered these words, her voice barely carrying, overwhelmed by her emotions. It didn't take him long to calculate in his head. Thoughts, feelings, deductions, pain, all of it was etched on his face. He covered his face with his hands, and Lara heard a muffled sob. His shoulders shook much like children who couldn't calm down. Laura froze. She suddenly felt frightened. What would happen next? A knock on the office door brought him back to reality. He straightened up in his chair, wiped his cheeks with his palms, and said loudly, "Come in, Count Schwarzenberg. Breakfast is already set in the dining room. Frau Birgit is waiting for you too," a voice from outside said. "Thank you, Peter. Please tell them we'll be there in 10 minutes, nodding, the servant politely bowed and disappeared through the doorway. Alex looked at his guest. "So, Laura, are you my daughter?" Laura simply lowered her gaze. She had heard about German reserve and didn't expect warm embraces. But Alex got up from his chair, circumventing the massive oak writing desk, and approached Laura. She rose to meet him. He took her hands in his own and drew her into an embrace, standing against his chest where her heart was pounding wildly. Laura suddenly felt at home. She was a little girl again, longing to say daddy just once. Now she wasn't alone. Laura also hugged her father. He had been searching for Obi for so many years, but didn't know where she had moved to from Washington. That's when Laura appeared. This was happiness. Laura wished Ronald were here, then her happiness would be complete. She had to know why her mother had acted this way, but that was something she would never learn. Finally, he released her from his chest and looked into her face. "Well, of course, you look just like me, my girl. It's like I'm looking in a mirror. My God, this is a miracle." He laughed through his tears while holding onto his daughter's hands. "I have something to give you." Laura hesitated but managed to speak through the emotions. He looked at her questioningly, and she took out the letters and the ring from her bag. Seeing the ring, Alex closed his mouth with his hand, as if he were afraid he might scream. He seemed on the verge of losing control. "This ring, I gave it to Obi on the last day we met. I proposed to her then. She accepted, but then she disappeared." He touched the ring with his fingers, stroked the cut gem, and seemed to be lost in thought. "She kept it all these years." Then his gaze fell on the letters, and recognizing the handwriting, he feverishly began reading them. After reading all 3 letters, Alex looked at Laura again, tears streaming down his face. "I lost the love of my life. I had almost come to terms with it, learned to live without her. But fate has given me a special gift." Now he was smiling. "She gave me you, my daughter, my flesh and blood, born to the woman who forever stole my heart. I found out by accident when I was going through my mother's things. I thought my father had died. You must have been very lonely when she left." He looked at her with concern and compassion. "Yes, very, and I so desperately wanted to find you, just to meet you, to talk. I don't want anything, really." He put a finger to her lips, and she fell silent mid-sentence. "We'll go now, and you'll meet your grandmother afterward. We'll come back here, and we'll talk for a long time. You'll tell me everything about your life, about yourself, about your mother." Laura nodded. By the time they reached the dining room, she had calmed down a bit, even though everything seemed like a fairy tale, a trick of her mind, a magical dream. She realized her life had changed forever. Her father had believed her immediately and without question. He didn't send her away or doubt anything. The dining room in the Schwarzenberg family residence was decorated in calm pastel tones, light tapestries, light antique furniture in the late Rococo style, and a magnificent buffet with a white oak body and golden inlays on the cabinet and bay windows particularly impressed Laura, a lover of vintage and antiquity. The buffet was filled with exquisite dishes the likes of which Laura had never seen before. At the head of the long table, covered with a delicate white tablecloth on which breakfast was set, sat a petite old lady with completely white hair styled into a neat coil at the nape of her neck. Her oval face with thin lips and a small straight nose, over which round glasses perched, had an air of displeasure about it. "Good morning. I'm sorry for keeping you waiting, Mother." Alex politely greeted his mother, but I had very good reasons for it, and he, placing his hand on Lara's back, gently pushed her toward the table. Birgit took a sip of her tea without much fuss. I didn't think another tearful interview with a young journalist was more important than breakfast with her mother on Christmas Eve. He seemed to let her words go in one ear and out the other. "Let me introduce you, Mother, to Laura Gilbert. She just arrived from Washington yesterday." At these words, the woman's face stretched and froze. Her hand holding a teacup noisily hit the table. The fragrant liquid splashed and left stains on the pristine white tablecloth. She took a few seconds to process what was happening and then asked Laura the same question she had asked before. How old are you, young lady? She looked at Laura so arrogantly that Laura began to slowly understand why her mother had run away from her happiness. I'm 30 years old, ma'am, the old lady gasped for air. So, she's your daughter, she said, looking at her son. It's not hard to guess given that you look like two peas in a pod. I knew this moment would come sooner or later. Alex was stunned, first looking at Laura, then at his mother. You knew? He repeated the question. You knew that Obi was pregnant? The old lady took another sip of her tea, her chin betraying a tremor. She gazed out of the window where the December sun bathed the park's pathways in golden light. Yes, she replied, her voice choked. Alex moved closer to the table and sat down next to her. Laura carefully took a seat at the far end. You knew I was going to be a father and said nothing, he whispered. For a moment, Laura thought he might strike her, his gaze was so fierce. All these years when I longed for Obi, suffered in the company of an unloved wife, agonized over not having an heir, you knew I had a child. Bridget remained silent, not looking at him, her eyes glistened. What have you done? Her son grabbed her wrist. What have you done? Everything I did for you, for the family, she blurted out. What did you say to Obi? Did she leave me because of you? Answer me. Then, the elderly woman burst into tears. Yes, it's my fault that she left. I threatened her, said she'd never be accepted into my family, that sooner or later you'd realize the mistake you made, that society would never accept her or her child. I told her she wouldn't get a penny from our estate. Then, I offered her money to leave, but she didn't take it. Oh my God, how could you? Alex stared at her in shock. This is my blood, Schwarzenberg blood, he nodded at Laura. I searched for them, Bridget blurted out. I searched for many years when you divorced Emma. I hired a private detective to find Obi and the child if it was born. I saw your suffering, and I regretted my actions, but they weren't in Washington. The trail went cold in some provincial town where she was last seen. I wanted to make amends, she cried, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. And Laura, who had lost her maternal grandmother in childhood, felt sorry for her. Alex sat with his head in his hands. Laura began to feel uncomfortable. They were talking as if she wasn't there. She suddenly thought about home, about Ronald, about Tiffany. She took a deep breath, attracting the attention of both her father and grandmother. Laura, Alex said, you can't even imagine how sorry I am. You grew up far from your family, far from me and our roots, our history. We have so much to catch up on. I had a mom, she said sadly, and she always loved and supported me so I wasn't alone. He moved closer to her and took her hands in his. No one and nothing will ever separate us now, he said. He glanced at his mother, who was quietly sobbing over her tea. You will live here in your ancestral home, which rightfully belongs to you. If you don't want to, you can choose any house you like, and we'll buy it for you. He looked at her with so much enthusiasm and hope that Laura couldn't bring herself to object. I really want to get to know you better, my daughter, my child. He kissed her hands. Laura noticed that his mother was secretly watching them and smiling through her tears. They spent the whole day together, talking in the living room and sharing their life stories. Alex eagerly absorbed every detail related to Obi. Bridget occasionally joined them, but her son didn't seem too pleased with her presence, and she would excuse herself under some pretext. In the evening, they went for a walk and, with her father, showed Laura the famous Cathedral of St. Peter where festive church services were taking place. Along the way, they encountered choral singers who greeted passers-by with friendly smiles, and Laura was even touched by the spirit of a true Catholic Christmas. Inside the cathedral, she couldn't contain her admiration, an enormous vaulted space with magnificent decor, thousands of candles, organ music, and sarcophagi containing the relics of saints. The stone floor bore the names of bishops and cardinals buried here, polished by the footsteps of countless visitors over the centuries. The cathedral was crowded with people, and they couldn't find an empty pew, so they stepped back out into the chilly December air. In a cozy street cafe, Lara and Alex enjoyed aromatic mulled wine and cheesy mozzarella balls with crispy cornflakes. Then, they strolled along the River Moselle's embankment, walking in the direction of a pedestrian bridge leading to the upscale neighborhood of grand villas and mansions. This Christmas, she received the best gift ever, Alex said with a smile as they reached the gates of the princely residence. It's a pity that my happiness will never be complete without your mother. You must accept it and move on, just like I have. Lara squeezed his hand. He nodded sadly, and they headed toward the house. In the dining room, just like in the morning, Bridget was waiting for them. She was sitting at the head of the table, looking as tense as a bowstring, her thin lips pressed tightly together. Lara suddenly realized that she wasn't angry with her anymore. She looked so guilty and miserable that Lara, giving in to a sudden impulse, walked up to her and hugged her. Startled, Bridget jumped in her chair and stared at her son, who was equally surprised and frozen halfway to the dinner table, which was set for a festive meal. They both expected a scolding tirade from his quarrelsome mother. Bridget gently pushed her granddaughter away and wiped her uninvited tears, then said in a businesslike tone, "Since you were late for the Christmas dinner, you may not change." Upon hearing these words, Prince Alex Schwarzenberg chuckled in relief. Christmas morning was overcast and rainy. Lara woke up in her own bedroom under the same roof, and the first thing she did was dial Ronald's number. It was strange. After several long rings, there were short ones. Apparently, he hung up. Lara missed him so desperately that even reuniting with her father couldn't make her happy. She felt lost and lonely. Several times throughout the day, she called him, and the same story repeated. Tiffany listened to her story, holding her breath, and promised to find out what had happened to Ronald. On December 31st, a formal reception was planned where Prince von Schwarzenberg intended to introduce his unexpectedly discovered daughter to high society. Consequently, the entire day saw tailors and stylists, local newspaper reporters, and even a journalist from Berlin coming and going residents. Lara was exhausted by the intense attention focused on her, and in the evening, after dinner, she spent some quality time with her father in the distant living room where a warm fire blazed in the fireplace. This time, she shared her dreams of professional self-realization with him, and he enthusiastically embraced the idea, suggesting they start their own business in Germany. He spoke about it so fervently and listened to her attentively that Lara felt ashamed. His plans would never come to fruition. After New Year's, she would return home to America, where there was someone she would choose over the prospect of living close to her family. Maybe I should tell Alex about Ronald. Perhaps he'll understand me after all. He also had a great love in his life, thought Lara. She said without holding anything back, sharing the long story of their relationship with Ronald. She talked about his character, his responsibility towards his sick sister, and how her meeting with her father was made possible solely because of his efforts and connections. Alex listened intently to the entire story. "So, this young man holds a very important place in your life?" he asked with a smile, tilting his head to the side and looking at his daughter with adoration. Lara nodded. "And he's probably very upset with me." "Why would he be upset?" Alex inquired. Lara told him about Samantha, the money she had left behind before leaving. "Ah, women," Alex said with a gentle reproach, "you can be so impulsive in your good deeds." "Of course, he's upset with you, my dear. But what should I do?" Her voice quivered betrayingly. "Of course, you should rush to him with all your might. But what about the reception? What about your plans?" He chuckled. "Well, we'll hold the reception, and on the morning of January 1st, you'll be on a plane to Washington. I'll take care of everything. Just promise me you'll come back to me." "I promise, Dad." Lara was so grateful to him that she couldn't help but lean against her father's chest. He gently stroked her hair and added, "I'll call my good friend in Berlin. He's a prominent medical professor. We'll try to help your lover's sister." Thank you so much," Lara warmly thanked him. A few minutes later, she was climbing the winding staircase to her room with the intention of calling Tiffany right away. The uncertainty was tearing her apart. She hadn't heard Ronald's voice in 2 days. Once in her bedroom, she immediately dialed her friend's number. "Hello," she heard a raspy voice on the other end. "Tiffany?" "Laura, is that you?" "It's me," Laura said, a bit flustered. "What's wrong with your voice?" It turned out that Tiffany had come down with a fever and hadn't managed to see Ronald before leaving. He had been ignoring Tiffany's calls as well. Wishing her friend a speedy recovery and hanging up, Laura dialed Samantha's number. "The subscriber is out of the network coverage area," said an annoying voice on the other end. "What's going on?" Laura wondered aloud. Has something happened? She was at a loss due to her ignorance. 3 days until the reception had passed quickly. She had managed to get to know many uncles and aunts, learn more about her father and grandmother, and realized that her life would never be the same again. On the day of the reception, Laura woke up with a terrible headache. She had dreamed of Ronald with his arms outstretched towards her, a sick Tiffany, and Samantha in a knitted cap lying in a hospital bed. In addition to all this, her phone was still silent. None of her calls had been answered. Unable to take it anymore, Laura didn't even delay and immediately dialed Ronald's number again. Still silence. She couldn't bear it any longer. After hanging up, her phone rang. It was Tiffany. "Hello?" Laura answered with a hoarse voice. "Laura, something happened. Ronald had an accident. I don't know any details because I've been lying in bed all day." Laura didn't wait to hear the rest. 15 minutes later, she stood in the living room of her new home with a suitcase in hand, explaining the situation to her father. The house was already prepared for the reception, and additional staff were scurrying around with trays, candelabras, stacks of tablecloths, and curtains. She was so nervous that her hands were trembling. Alex sat her down in a chair, poured a glass of wine, and picked up the phone. 20 minutes later, she had booked a direct flight from Frankfurt to Washington. She was set to land at the Eastern Airport at exactly 10 p.m. The personal driver of Alex Schwarzenberg had sped her from Trier to Frankfurt in just an hour and a half, and soon Laura was on her way to America. The day flew by in a blur, and as she sat in a taxi taking her from the airport, Laura contemplated what she might lose. Ronald, what happened to him? Are his injuries serious? She didn't know any of this, just the name of the hospital where he was being treated. Tiffany had sent her an SMS when she was still in the air, falling to her knees from exhaustion and tension. Laura practically stumbled out of the taxi near the Central City Hospital, dragging her suitcase behind her. She passed the empty reception area, for some reason with music and sounds of celebration emanating from somewhere. Then it suddenly hit her, it was New Year's Eve. How could she forget that? Finally, after navigating through countless corridors of the reception department, she found a girl in a white coat and handed her a €50 bill. In a nearly hysterical state, Laura asked her to escort her to the room of Ronald in the trauma ward. The young nurse, her eyes widened with surprise, looked at the frantic girl with a suitcase demanding to see the patient. She took the money and escorted Laura to the right floor. "I don't know the room number, I'm sorry, but I can ask," the girl squeaked timidly. Laura nodded. "Oh, it's almost midnight, New Year's Eve," the girl exclaimed, clearly flustered, and hurriedly retreated. Laura briskly walked through the ward, leaving her suitcase at the nurse's station. The corridor was quiet, and Laura, gathering her courage, prepared to knock on every door. As she was about to raise her hand to knock on the door of the first room, it swung open, and Laura saw Samantha's exhausted face. Startled, she jumped so much that she dropped the glass she was holding. "Samantha, what happened?" Laura exclaimed. She heard Ronald's weak voice from inside the room. Laura quickly hugged Samantha and, without saying anything, burst into the room. It was a single room, dimly lit with only a small nightlight on the bedside table. In the center of the room, on a high bed, lay a man, the one she had longed for more than anything else in the world. His head and torso were wrapped in bandages, and his left leg was suspended. Laura and Ronald looked at each other in silence while outside, fireworks erupted in a burst of celebration. "Happy New Year, Ronald," Laura exclaimed. She heard Ronald's weak voice, "Happy New Year, Laura." "Did you really think I wouldn't come?" he asked, tears streaming down his face. That I would trade you for some foreign prince? He looked at her apologetically but remained silent. My God, Ronald, you're such a blockhead, just impossible, she scolded him gently. She moved closer to him, and their lips met. In that moment, Lara realized how much she needed him, like air, like light. She had loved him all her life, hiding from her own feelings, wasting precious time on the wrong people. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Ronald hugged her tenderly but firmly, as if to show that he would never let her go again. My love, I missed you so much. Standing by the door, watching them, was Samantha, crying tears of joy. They welcomed spring in Berlin, where Samantha underwent immunotherapy. Her condition improved, and the doctor whom Alex had recommended to Lara informed them that the illness was in remission. Back in Trier, Lara grew closer to her new family, who adored Ronald. By the end of March, they were hugging at the airport with Tiffany, who had come for their engagement. It was warm and sunny, nature was waking up from its winter slumber, delighting the eye with the fresh green of parks and squares. In the airport waiting area, Lara and Ronald were holding hands when they spotted a familiar figure in the crowd, taking a huge suitcase from her hands. Ronald began to squeeze through the crowd of welcomers and travelers, while the two girls, hugging each other, followed him. Do you know who I saw recently at the women's clinic? Your ex, Tiffany whispered in Lara's ear. He brought his secretary for an ultrasound, and they had a heated argument right in front of the office because she put the wrong emphasis on words. Can you imagine? Of course, I greeted him and casually mentioned that you found your father, a German prince. You should have seen the expression on his face, Laura laughed. Now your face is going to change, Tiffany playfully squinted one eye. You're becoming an aunt and godmother soon. Goodness gracious, Tiffany, exclaimed Lara as she hugged Laura tightly, her eyes welling up with tears. Lara, I'm so happy for you. Hey, what's with the flood? Ronald approached them and hugged both of them by the shoulders. Everything's going to be fine. Yeah, Lara whispered, burying her face in his shoulder, now everything is definitely fine. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.